HMP Belmarsh, what high-security terrorists eat every day. Every morning, in a building the British government does not fully acknowledge, a meal tray slides under a door. Not through a hatch. Not handed over by a guard. Slid. Because the man on the other side of that door is considered too dangerous for even a brief moment of human contact at 6 a.m. The tray holds porridge. A bread roll. A small carton of juice. 3 items. Approximately 400 calories. It is the first meal of the day for men convicted of mass murder plots, men who once commanded terrorist cells across multiple continents, men the British state considers among the greatest threats to national security alive today. And here is the thing that nobody talks about: the food is only the beginning. What happens between that morning tray and the one that arrives at dinner tells a story far darker than what's on the menu. The question nobody asks. Southeast London. Thamesmead. A semi-industrial stretch of road that most people drive past without a second thought. But buried behind a perimeter wall that stretches for nearly a mile, a wall designed not just to keep people in, but to keep curious eyes out, sits His Majesty's Prison Belmarsh. More specifically, inside Belmarsh, there is a unit within the unit. A sealed compound with 48 single cells. No mixing with the general population. No shared dining hall. No communal recreation time in the conventional sense. This is the high-security unit, and it holds the men the British state considers most capable of doing catastrophic damage if they were ever to communicate freely, organize, or simply be allowed to breathe the same air as ordinary prisoners. The question everyone should be asking is not just who is in there. The question is, what does a day actually look like when you are one of them? Stay with this, because the answer changes how you think about punishment itself. Before we go any further, if stories like this, the kind that pull back the curtain on what really happens inside the walls they don't show on the news, if that's what keeps you watching at midnight, then hit that subscribe button right now. Every week this channel goes somewhere most people don't. And you don't want to miss what's coming later in this video, because what happens inside that high-security unit at mealtimes is not what anyone expected, and it says something profound about what Britain believes punishment is actually for. What Hellmarsh actually is. Belmarsh opened its gates on April 2, 1991. It was built on the grounds of the former Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, a place that once manufactured weapons for the British Empire. There is a grim poetry in that. The first adult prison constructed in London since Wormwood Scrubs in 1874. Purpose-built, not inherited. Designed from scratch with a single guiding philosophy: maximum control. The prison houses approximately 910 men at any given time, though overcrowding routinely pushes that number higher. It sits adjacent to Woolwich Crown Court, which means that some of the most explosive trials in British legal history have seen defendants shackled and transferred just meters from their cell to a courtroom. Over the years, Belmarsh earned a nickname, Hellmarsh. The name was coined not by journalists but by a former inmate, the conservative politician and best-selling novelist Geoffrey Archer, who served time there for perjury. Even a man of considerable privilege, a man with resources, connections and public profile, called it hell. For the men inside the high-security unit, it is something else entirely. A world governed not by punishment in the conventional sense, but by something colder, total, permanent, architectural control. The prison within the prison. Within Belmarsh's perimeter wall, there exists a structure that functions as an entirely separate institution. The High Security Unit, the HSU, is a self-contained compound holding up to 48 men in individual cells. It has its own exercise yard. Its own gym. Its own segregation unit, a punishment within the punishment. The men inside do not eat in a shared dining hall. They do not queue for food. They do not make choices in the way ordinary prisoners do. Food comes to them. And that single logistical detail, the fact that meals are delivered rather than collected, tells you everything about the psychology of this place. It is designed to eliminate every moment of organic human interaction. Every handoff, every queue, every brief conversation with a server at a prison servery, all of it, gone. The HSU was originally built to hold IRA prisoners during the height of the Troubles. It has since held KGB agents, Al-Qaeda operatives, jihadist recruiters, and organized crime lords so networked that even a brief phone call from inside a standard prison wing could theoretically move money, people, or weapons across borders. The architecture is not cruelty. It is, in the government's framing, mathematics. And the food, as we will see, is part of that equation. 6 a.m., the sound before the light. 6 a.m. The light in the HSU cell does not come from a window, not in any meaningful sense. It seeps from a narrow slit designed to provide ventilation and minimal daylight without offering a view, a sightline, or a point of focus for the outside world. What comes before the light, before the eyes adjust, is sound. The low metallic grind of the outer corridor as a guard begins the morning round. Footsteps. Measured. Never hurried. Because in the HSU, hurrying signals something has gone wrong, and something going wrong is what every protocol in this building is designed to prevent. The morning food pack, prepared the previous evening in the kitchen and sealed, has already been placed in position. This is not improvisation. It is choreography. The breakfast pack contains porridge oats or a cereal equivalent, a bread roll, a small portion of margarine, a hot drink sachet, tea or instant coffee, and occasionally a piece of fruit. It arrives before most of London has stirred. The man receiving it may have been awake for hours. Sleep, in a place where the light never fully disappears and the ambient noise of institutional machinery never fully quiets, is a negotiation rather than a guarantee. What 400 calories means in here. Outside these walls, food is identity. It is culture, comfort, memory, and status. A man who once moved across borders funding terrorist operations likely ate well. Lamb prepared according to strict religious tradition. Flatbreads from a particular region. The specific sweetness of cardamom in tea made by someone who knew how he liked it. Inside the HSU, food becomes something else entirely. It becomes a unit of time. Inmates described by former staff as highly intelligent and psychologically adaptive, men who have proven capable of operating entire criminal or ideological enterprises under surveillance, quickly learn to use mealtimes as the skeleton of their day. The arrival of breakfast marks the end of the night. The arrival of lunch marks the halfway point of the permitted hours outside the cell. The arrival of dinner signals that the day is over and the long hours of lockdown are beginning again. Food is not sustenance here as much as it is a clock. And in a place specifically designed to disorient a man's sense of time, autonomy, and social connection, that clock becomes one of the few things he can reliably anticipate. That reliability, as small and institutional as it is, matters more than anyone on the outside would think. The Halal Question. A significant proportion of the men held in the HSU on terrorism-related charges are Muslim. And British prison law, under the prison rules, requires that dietary needs linked to religious observance be accommodated. This is not generosity. It is legal obligation and, from an operational standpoint, pragmatic management. A prisoner who believes his religious practice is being violated is a prisoner with a legitimate grievance that could fuel radicalism, legal challenges, or both. So halal meals are provided. A full-time imam was brought onto Belmarsh's staff as early as 2002. The prison chapel is formally converted into a mosque every Friday for Jumu'ah, the communal prayer that is, in Islamic tradition, one of the week's most significant religious obligations. This is the detail that surprises most people when they hear it. The most security-hardened prison in Britain, a place where men are confined for up to 22 hours a day, acknowledges the call to prayer. What does that tell us? It tells us that Belmarsh is not medieval. It is modern. And modern high-security imprisonment is built not on breaking men through starvation or spiritual denial, but on something far more sophisticated, the precise calibration of what is given and what is withheld. 22 hours. 22 hours. That is the number that appears in official descriptions of the HSU regime. Up to 22 hours per day inside a single cell. Let that settle for a moment. A cell in the HSU measures approximately 6 paces in any direction. It contains a bed, a desk, a toilet and wash basin unit, and, for prisoners on the standard incentive level, a small television. The television is significant. It is the primary window to a world the prisoner is no longer permitted to touch. News, football, documentaries, and, according to former staff and prisoner accounts, an almost compulsive monitoring of how their own cases, their ideological movements, their former organizations are discussed in the media. These are not broken men in the conventional sense. They are frequently men of significant intellectual capability, ideological conviction, and operational experience. Confining that kind of mind to 6 paces and a television creates a particular kind of psychological pressure that researchers have spent decades studying. And in those 22 hours, food, its arrival, its consumption, the ritual of it, becomes one of the very few sensory events that punctuates the silence. We are about to get to what happens in the other 2 hours. And it is in those 2 hours that the real dynamics of the HSU become visible. The 2 hours. 2 hours out of cell. That is the allocation. In practice, it often breaks into 1 hour of exercise in the dedicated HSU yard and 1 hour of what the prison system classifies as purposeful activity, education, gym access, or a legal consultation. The exercise yard in the HSU is not a yard in any leisurely sense. It is a contained space with high concrete walls, open sky above, and cameras at every angle. A man who has spent 22 hours in 6 paces now walks the perimeter of a slightly larger space, still watched, still measured, still within a geometry designed to remind him of his precise position within the state's grip. But here is where something important happens. These 2 hours are the hours of communication, real communication, not mediated by a television screen. And even among Britain's most isolated prisoners, hierarchies form. Alliances are tested. A nod acknowledged across a yard. A request passed through a trusted intermediary. Former staff have spoken, carefully, never for attribution, about the way men in high-security units develop elaborate nonverbal communication systems. Eye contact that holds a fraction of a second longer than neutral. Positioning in a yard that conveys affiliation. The human animal, it seems, will always find a way to establish social architecture. Even here. Especially here. And somewhere in the middle of all this, at around midday, the next meal arrives. Lunch, cold, calculated, 2 choices. The inspection reports that periodically assess Belmarsh's conditions are dry, bureaucratic documents, but they contain details that illuminate the texture of life inside in ways no journalist's account quite matches. The 2021 inspection report noted specifically that only 36% of Belmarsh prisoners considered the food to be good. The report describes lunch as a cold meal with just 2 choices. In the HSU, those choices are brought directly to the cell. Imagine the psychological significance of that sentence, 2 choices. Not a menu. Not the ability to refuse and select something else. 2 things. Take it or don't. For men who, in their previous lives, may have commanded significant resources, who may have orchestrated complex logistics across international borders, who made high-stakes decisions as a matter of course, the reduction to 2 choices for every meal is not incidental. It is the architecture of diminishment. Not starvation. Not deprivation in the legal sense. But a relentless, systemic reduction of agency down to a binary. And the human mind, under that kind of sustained reduction, does not simply accept it. It rebels in the only ways available, through the rituals it creates around what little it still controls. The canteen, the underground economy. Beyond the official meals, prisoners at Belmarsh, including those in the HSU, have access to a weekly canteen order. Using money held on their prison account, funded by family or by wages earned through prison labor, they can purchase a limited range of goods. Instant noodles. Tinned mackerel. Biscuits. Coffee. Chocolate bars. Shower gel. Phone credit. These items are not luxury. They are the microeconomy of survival and status. In the HSU, where face-to-face social interaction is almost entirely absent, the canteen order becomes one of the few ways a man can express preference, personal taste, and, critically, care for others. A bag of coffee given through official channels to another prisoner in the unit. A packet of biscuits passed to a legal visitor to take to a family member. The prison staff are alert to these exchanges. The intelligence value of understanding what moves between prisoners, even in the form of instant noodles, should not be underestimated. Because in an environment stripped of nearly every other social instrument, food is never just food. It is the medium through which power, loyalty, gratitude, and threat are communicated. Stay with us, because what happens at dinner, and specifically the ritual that surrounds it, is where this story gets genuinely unexpected. The famous names. The names that have passed through Belmarsh's HSU read like a tour through 2 decades of global security headlines. Abu Qatada, the Jordanian-born cleric described by a British judge as Osama bin Laden's ambassador in Europe, spent years in the HSU, fighting his extradition through the courts while eating his daily cold lunch 2 steps from a toilet. Anjem Choudary, the British Islamist preacher whose Al-Muhajirin network was linked by prosecutors to radicalizing multiple individuals who later committed attacks, was held at Belmarsh. Julian Assange, not a terrorist but a man the American government wanted badly enough to apply serious diplomatic pressure, spent years in the HSU fighting extradition, watching his meals slide under a door while his legal team fought in the courts adjacent to his cell. Each of these men arrived in the HSU as a figure of tremendous perceived power, a man with followers, with ideology, with infrastructure behind him. Each of them ate their breakfast from a plastic tray that was prepared the night before and slid under a door before London had woken up. The gap between those two realities, the grandiosity of the ideology and the diminishment of the tray, is where Belmarsh does its real work. What the food doesn't tell you. But here is what the official inspection reports, the government documents, and the approved accounts of life in Belmarsh all carefully avoid saying. The food tells you what the state provides. It does not tell you what happens in the mind of a man who has been reduced to waiting for it. Researchers studying prolonged isolation, not in prisons, but in polar research stations, in submarine deployments, in monastic settings, consistently find that the human brain, denied external stimulation, begins generating its own. Rituals emerge. Counting. Memorization. Prayer schedules maintained with obsessive precision. Exercise routines timed not by a clock but by the number of steps paced in a cell. And food, its preparation, even when preparation means nothing more than tearing open a sachet and adding hot water, becomes ceremony. A former prison psychologist who worked in a high-security environment described it this way: the man who eats his biscuits in a specific order, always saving one type for last, who drinks his tea only after it has cooled for exactly the time he has decided it should cool, that man is not being irrational. He is constructing a self in the only space where the state cannot follow him. And it is in that psychological space, invisible to the cameras, undetectable by the guards, where the most interesting things in Belmarsh actually happen. We're halfway through this story. Don't look away now. You're still here, halfway through, and that tells me something about you. You're not watching for shock value. You want to understand how these systems actually work, what they reveal about justice, power, and the human mind. That's exactly who this channel is for. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the second half of this story is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. We're about to talk about what happens when the food becomes a weapon. Not in the way you might think. Dinner and the darkening. Evening in the HSU arrives not as a color change, the windows are too narrow for that, but as a shift in the quality of sound. The daytime rhythm of officer movements, the occasional procedural noise of the unit's operation, begins to thin. The dinner meal arrives. Unlike the cold lunch, dinner in British prisons is typically the hot meal of the day, a rotation of options that might include a meat stew, a pasta dish, a rice-based meal, or a vegetarian alternative. For HSU prisoners observing halal requirements, the option is segregated and labeled. The meal is, by most accounts, functional. Not pleasant. Not designed to be pleasant. At around 1,800 to 2,000 calories for the full day's provision, the nutritional baseline is technically met. And then the cell door closes for the evening, and the real duration of Belmarsh begins. Because if 22 hours is the rule, the night portion of those hours, the hours after dinner when there is no purposeful activity, no legal consultation, no exercise, those are the hours that former inmates and prison psychologists describe as the crucible. The hours where the architecture of isolation does its most intimate work. Hunger strikes, when food becomes resistance. There is one moment when food in the HSU stops being about nutrition, psychology, or routine, and becomes something else entirely. A weapon. The hunger strike is the only act of complete unilateral resistance available to a man who has been stripped of every other form of agency. You cannot run. You cannot fight effectively against a system designed specifically to contain physical resistance. You cannot communicate freely. But you can refuse the tray. And in refusing the tray, you make the state responsible for your body in a way it cannot ignore. Belmarsh has seen hunger strikes. British prisons have a long and complicated history with them, most devastatingly during the IRA campaign of the 1980s, when 10 men died in the Maze prison in a hunger strike that transformed the entire political landscape of Northern Ireland. The HSU at Belmarsh was built, in part, as a response to that crisis. Prison medical staff are trained to monitor a hunger-striking prisoner's vitals, to intervene before irreversible organ damage occurs, and to navigate the deeply contested ethics of force-feeding, a practice that the British Medical Association considers a form of assault when performed on a competent adult who has made a conscious choice. The hunger-striking prisoner understands all of this. It is not desperation. It is strategy. Refined, calculated, and executed with the same deliberate patience that characterizes everything else these men do. Food refused is a press conference without a microphone. The Imam and the kitchen. There is a figure in this story who moves between worlds in a way that nobody else in Belmarsh does. The prison Imam. Recruited full-time since 2002, the Imam at Belmarsh occupies a position of extraordinary sensitivity, trusted by the institution to provide genuine religious care, trusted by some inmates as the only neutral presence who speaks to them not as a security risk but as a human being with a soul worth attending to. On Friday, the prison chapel is formally reconfigured. Prayer mats laid down. The direction of Mecca established. And men who spend the other 6 days of the week locked in individual cells, watched by cameras, their every move documented in a custody record, stand side by side in prayer. For those men, this is, by their own reported accounts, the moment in the week that feels most human. Not the food. Not the exercise. The prayer. And the kitchen that prepared the halal meal they will eat that Friday evening did so because the law required it, yes, but also because the officials who run Belmarsh have learned something that is rarely said out loud. A man who believes his God is being honored in his captivity is, paradoxically, easier to contain than a man who believes his God is being insulted. Religion in the HSU is not compassion. It is, among other things, a management tool. And the meal tray reflects it. The Food Hygiene Certificate. Here is a detail that the inspection reports include without irony, though it deserves a moment of pause. The prisoners who work in the Belmarsh kitchen, not the HSU prisoners, who are never permitted to work in communal areas, but the general population prisoners assigned to food preparation duties, are required to complete a basic food hygiene certificate. Level 2. The same qualification required of someone working in a cafe on the high street. They wear hairnets. They wash their hands according to documented procedure. The servery is described in inspection reports as clean and tidy. There is something almost vertiginous about this. A man serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery, or a man awaiting trial for gang-related murder, is standing in a kitchen, certified, aproned, following food safety regulations, preparing meals that will be placed in a sealed pack and slid under the door of a cell containing one of the most surveilled human beings on the planet. The procedural normalcy of it. The layers of bureaucratic mundanity stacked on top of extraordinary human darkness. This is what Belmarsh actually is, stripped of the dramatic framing, a place where the machinery of the ordinary and the weight of the extraordinary exist side by side, every single day, 3 meals at a time. The inspection reports silence. In September 2024, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons published its latest unannounced inspection report on Belmarsh. It covers violence rates, education provision, time out of cell, drug use, healthcare, and food. It is thorough in the way government documents are thorough, comprehensive within a very specific frame. It notes that only 36% of prisoners surveyed rated the food as good. It notes that breakfast packs are issued the evening before, a detail that reveals, quietly, that the kitchen's operational rhythm is built around staff logistics rather than prisoner experience. It notes that lunch is cold with 2 choices. It records this without comment. Because to comment would be to acknowledge something the report is not designed to process, that the texture of a man's day, the quality of what he eats, the number of choices available to him, shapes his psychology in ways that reverberate far beyond his individual cell. The report cannot say, this man, eating this cold lunch with these 2 options, in this 6-pace room, for the 3rd consecutive year, is becoming something the institution has not fully modeled. It can only note the food was cold and there were 2 choices. What the report cannot capture is what those 2 choices produce over time. And that is precisely where the story lives. Radicalisation and the dining table. One of the foundational justifications for the HSU's existence is the prevention of radicalisation. The theory is straightforward: men capable of inspiring ideological violence must not be permitted to communicate freely with the general prison population. The main house blocks at Belmarsh hold hundreds of men, many young, many from communities historically targeted by extremist recruiters, many already in states of profound alienation from the society that incarcerated them. The men in the HSU, in the state's assessment, are precisely the kind of figures those younger men could be drawn to, ideologically, spiritually, tribally. The HSU's separation is designed to cut that circuit. And in the dining hall, or rather, in the absence of a dining hall, it does. There is no shared table. No moment where a young prisoner serving 2 years for drug possession sits across from a man with decades of jihadist network experience and finds in him something that answers an unanswered question. The sealed meal packs, the individual cells, the choreographed isolation, all of it exists to prevent a conversation that hasn't happened yet. But here is the paradox that prison sociologists have documented extensively: isolation, without exception, does not diminish ideological fervor. It concentrates it. The man who eats alone, thinks alone, prays alone, in a 6-pace cell for 22 hours a day, does not moderate. He refines. The TV tray and the world outside. Every night, after the dinner tray has been collected and the door secured for the final time, the television is on. This is not a privilege extended freely. It is an earned incentive under the Incentives and Earned Privileges Scheme, the IEP, which governs what additional comforts a prisoner can access based on his behavior and compliance. Behave. Do not disrupt. Do not resist. And you get a television. The size of a small monitor. Fixed to the wall. Receiving the standard broadcast channels. And so the most closely monitored men in Britain spend their evenings watching the same things you watch. The news. The football. The documentaries about crime. Some, by reported accounts, watch the news coverage of events connected to their own ideological world with an attention that is almost clinical. They are observers, now. Permanently removed from the field. Watching through a screen from a cell. Their dinner has been eaten. Their day has effectively ended. And the distance between the world on the television and the cell they are sitting in is not just physical. It is a distance that the institution has constructed meal by meal, door by door, day by day. It is the distance between agency and its absence. And it is that distance, more than any sentence, more than any verdict, that is the true substance of what Belmarsh is doing. The twist, what they're eating now. Right now, tonight, as you watch this video, the HSU at Belmarsh is occupied. The cells are lit by the dim ambient glow of televisions and corridor lighting. The dinner trays from this evening have been collected. The men inside are watching screens, or reading, or praying, or simply lying in the quiet of a space that will not change tomorrow, or the day after, or the year after. Some of them will be there for another decade. Some for 2. 1 or 2 may never leave at all. And tomorrow morning, before London has opened its eyes, a prepared breakfast pack, porridge, bread, margarine, a hot drink sachet, will be positioned outside a cell door and slid across the threshold. It will happen in HMP Belmarsh's high-security unit as reliably as sunrise. And the man on the other side of that door will eat it, in 6 paces of space, alone, under the eye of a camera that has never blinked. This is not a story that ended. It is a story that is happening right now. And the question it raises is not whether the men inside deserve to be there. Most of them, by any reasonable legal standard, do. The question it raises is what this kind of life, conducted at this level of precision and isolation, over years and decades, actually produces. Because nobody, not the inspection reports, not the government policy documents, not the prison psychologists, has fully answered that. The men the system forgets to model. Criminologists who study long-term high-security imprisonment speak of a phenomenon they call institutionalization, the gradual restructuring of a person's psychology around the rhythms, rules, and architecture of confinement. The irony is that the very rigidity that makes high-security imprisonment effective as a containment strategy also accelerates this process. A man who has eaten from a tray for a decade does not merely adapt. He becomes, in some measurable neurological sense, a different person, one whose capacity to navigate the complexity, ambiguity, and unpredictability of the outside world has been systematically eroded. For men serving very long sentences, this is arguably irrelevant. They are never coming out. But for those on shorter terms, remand prisoners awaiting trial, those whose sentences eventually end, the question of what Belmarsh's regime produces is genuinely consequential. A man who entered the HSU as a radicalized but socially functional person, and who exits after years of 22-hour confinement, is not the same man. He is, in multiple documented senses, more isolated, more psychologically rigid, and more likely to struggle with reintegration than when he arrived. The meal tray did not cause this. But the meal tray is its daily symbol. What Britain believes punishment is for. British criminal justice operates on 4 stated principles: punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, and public protection. In the mainstream prison estate, the Category B and C prisons where the majority of inmates serve their sentences, there is at least a formal commitment to all 4. There are education programs. There are workshop skills. There is a listener scheme staffed by trained inmate volunteers. There are release plans. In the HSU at Belmarsh, 3 of those 4 principles operate at a significant discount. Deterrence is largely irrelevant to a man already inside for planning an atrocity. The deterrent clearly did not work. Rehabilitation is structurally difficult to deliver in 22-hour isolation. Public protection is the one principle the HSU delivers with absolute certainty, contained within concrete and cameras and sealed meal packs. These men cannot harm the public. And punishment? That is the uncomfortable question. Because the British state does not officially describe the HSU as punitive. It describes it as protective. The restriction is presented not as suffering inflicted but as risk managed. But there is a fine line, and people far beyond these walls argue bitterly about where exactly it falls, between protecting the public and punishing a man through the architecture of his daily life. The verdict of the tray. Return, now, to the tray. Porridge. Bread. Margarine. A sachet of instant coffee. Slid under a door at 6 in the morning in southeast London, to a man the state has determined is too dangerous for ordinary human contact. This tray is not an accident of bureaucracy. It is the physical manifestation of a decision, a collective social decision made by legislators, judges, security services, and the democratic public that elected them, about what this person's day should look like. How many choices he should have. How much warmth his food should carry. How much of his day should be his own. The tray is the verdict. Not the judge's pronouncement. Not the prison sentence. Not the category classification. The tray, its contents, its temperature, its timing, the way it is delivered without eye contact or conversation, is the moment-by-moment enactment of what British society has decided these men deserve. And whether you believe that is justice, or pragmatism, or cruelty, or something far more complex than any of those words can hold, the tray arrives regardless. At 6 in the morning. Before London wakes. Behind a wall that stretches for a mile. Beyond the wire, what former inmates say. Not all who have passed through Belmarsh's main house blocks, not the HSU, but the general population, have stayed silent. Former inmates have spoken, carefully and without full attribution, about what the experience of being inside Belmarsh actually produces. One common thread: the food is almost universally described as one of the defining textures of the experience. Not because it is terrible, it is described as acceptable, if uninspiring, but because it is the axis around which time turns. Another thread: the relationships formed in the brief windows of communal time, the exercise period, the education class, the occasional association hour, are described as more intense, more significant, and more lastingly formative than any friendship formed in the outside world. When your social world is compressed to 2 hours a day, those 2 hours carry the weight of everything. And what people talk about, in those 2 hours, more than violence, more than ideology, more than legal strategy, is food. What they miss. What they'll eat when they get out. What their mother makes. What a particular city smells like at a particular time of year. Food is memory. And memory, in Belmarsh, is the last possession the state cannot confiscate. The architecture of forever. Belmarsh was built to last. Its concrete perimeter wall, its reinforced house blocks, its high security unit with its 48 cells, these are not temporary structures. They were designed with the expectation that Britain would continue to produce men dangerous enough to need containing within them. And that expectation has proved correct. The names change. The ideologies shift. The decades-defining security threat, the IRA, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, whatever comes next, sends its representatives through the HSU's intake process, and the unit absorbs them. The tray slides under the door. The sachet of instant coffee steams. The television broadcasts the news of a world the man inside is no longer part of. And outside, a mile of concrete wall separates all of this from a city that mostly does not think about it. This is not an accident of public attention. It is, in many ways, by design. Belmarsh works partly because we do not look at it too closely. The food slides under the door. The door stays closed. And London moves on. The final revelation, the real question. Here is what nobody tells you at the end of a story like this. The question is not whether the men inside the HSU at Belmarsh deserve to be there. Most of them, by the evidence presented in open court, by the verdicts of juries, by the findings of judges, they do. The question, the one that matters, the one that will outlast any individual case or any individual prisoner, is what kind of society designs a system like this, and then decides not to look at it? What does it mean to build a place where the most significant daily human interaction is a meal tray slid under a door, and then classify that as justice? What does it mean to strip a man down to 2 choices for lunch and call that public protection? These are not questions with clean answers. They are not designed to exonerate. They are designed to complicate. Because a justice system that we refuse to examine is not a justice system we can meaningfully call our own. The tray will slide under the door again tomorrow morning. The question is whether we think that is enough, and whether we have ever really asked ourselves what enough means. Stories like this one don't get told often. Not because the information isn't there, the inspection reports are public, the court records exist, the testimonies are on record. They don't get told because telling them requires sitting with discomfort. Refusing the easy answer. Looking at the tray and asking what it means, rather than just what it contains. This channel exists to have that conversation. If this video made you think differently, about justice, about punishment, about the invisible architecture of a society that locks people away and then moves on, then this channel is for you. Subscribe. Share this with someone you think needs to watch it. And the next video is already waiting, another story, another wall, another door that nobody is supposed to look behind. We'll see you there.